I'm Samantha Hart, 34, sitting at the defense table in my own courtroom, thumb tracing the edge of my red wool scarf in my lap. Across the aisle, Kevin and Karen Hart laughed quietly with their attorney, already imagining the $5.5 million they thought they were about to claim. They didn't even recognize me. They couldn't have guessed that the little girl they abandoned 30 years ago had grown into the woman who now held the gavel in her own hands. The bailiff's voice cut through the low murmur. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Samantha Hart." My parents stiffened, expecting a stranger. Instead, they were met with me. I walked past the bar, up the steps, and took my seat behind the bench. Their lawyer's smirk froze. The courtroom felt heavy, almost suffocating. I needed them and the world to see that the child they discarded had returned, not broken, but formidable. I needed everyone in this room to understand. I am not a ghost anymore. I am the reckoning. I needed you to be the jury today. If the people who brought you into this world discarded you like luggage, would you forgive or would you destroy them? Guilty or innocent, imagine your verdict before the trial even begins, because mine had been made long ago. It all began in 1994 at O'Hare International Airport, the loudest place I had ever been as a child. Terminal 3 vibrated beneath my tiny sneakers, the hum of escalators and conveyor belts resonating like a low-frequency roar. People rushed past, announcements echoed overhead, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with stale coffee, filling the cavernous space. But none of it belonged to me. I was 5, wrapped in a red wool scarf that scratched my neck and dragged on the filthy linoleum. I refused to take it off. That scarf was my only barrier against the biting draft of the automatic doors, my only comfort in a world that had just taught me I was replaceable. Kevin and Karen were ahead, not holding my hand, eyes scanning the terminal impatiently. Their movements were sharp, synchronized, more like executives running late than parents rushing to save a child. Karen glanced back once, voice clipped. "Keep up, Samantha. You're slowing us down." They led me past the ticket counters, past happy reunions and crying children, until we reached oversized baggage. It was a cavern of steel and conveyor belts where car seats, skis, and boxes tumbled endlessly. Kevin pointed at a bolted metal bench. "Wait here, count the bags, don't move until we come back." I looked up, voice small. "How long?" Karen didn't even glance at me. "Count 500 bags," she said. "By the time you finish, we'll be here." I pulled the scarf over my nose and started counting. 1, 2, a guitar case, a cardboard box taped shut. I reached 50, 100. The crowd thinned. The belt became hypnotic. By 500, the carousel slowed. Light dimmed as the last passengers left. That's when I understood something no 5-year-old should. They weren't late. They weren't lost. Relief had been on their faces when they left. They had dropped me deliberately. I was baggage to them. Heavy, burdensome, to be checked and never reclaimed. The silence hit me then, not peaceful but suffocating, pressing down on my chest until I felt invisible. That silence stole my voice for years. 4 years later, I barely spoke. I let the world happen to me because I was too afraid to make a sound. But 30 years later, that silence became a weapon in my hands, a tool I wielded from the bench to command respect and fear. Eventually, a Segway patrolling guard rolled by and noticed me. Before he could intervene, a man stepped from behind a pillar. Tall, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, calm but precise. He didn't touch me. He knelt to my level and said, "She's with me. My name is William." He stayed quietly as the authorities arrived, through foster care placements, and eventually became my anchor when the blood that was supposed to love me had let me fall. William died quietly decades later. At his service, I sat in the front row wearing the red scarf, feeling the weight of his silent guidance. The reading of his will revealed the scale of his hidden generosity. $5,500,000 left to me, accumulated over decades as an angel investor who lived simply to give abundantly. The news broke, and 2 days later, a process server arrived at my door, not with condolences, but with a lawsuit from Kevin and Karen Hart. They were suing for the fortune William had left me, alleging kidnapping, fraudulent custody, and decades of imagined suffering. Their greed was as palpable as it was grotesque. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I went into chambers mode, viewing the complaint as evidence, not emotion. Then I saw it, the ledger of their narcissism. When I was 5, I was a liability. To them, I had no human worth. They had abandoned me. Now, 30 years later, their calculation was tragically comedic. I had grown into a $5.5 million asset. Their attempt to cash in on me again was doomed. I called the most ruthless forensic accountant in the state. "Go back to 1994. Find everything," I instructed. My dining room table became a war room. Tax returns, property records, court filings, they all told the same story. Kevin and Karen Hart had sued American Continental Airlines in 1995, claiming my disappearance as their child was the airline's negligence. They had settled for $450,000, and in exchange, they had legally declared me dead. Signed affidavits confirmed it. We, the parents, acknowledge that the minor child, Samantha Hart, is presumed deceased. They had cashed in, and now 30 years later, they were trying to cash in again. I leaned back, letting the realization solidify into ice in my veins. The anger simmered, then crystallized. They had sold my life. They had spent my childhood as a ledger entry, and now they had walked back into my courtroom expecting to bargain with a victim. They hadn't met Samantha Hart. They had met the law itself. Motion denied. I whispered it to the empty room. The war had begun. Evidence gathering, financial tracing, and psychological traps, every move carefully measured. They had chosen to step back into the path of a woman who had survived everything they thought would break her. And now, every step they took would lead them directly into the legal snare I had spent 30 years crafting. The child they abandoned was gone, but the judge who would destroy them legally and completely had arrived. The war room at my apartment had become a battlefield. Tax filings, old property deeds, and court microfiche littered every surface. The city outside moved on, oblivious to the storm I was brewing. My red wool scarf still draped around my neck, not for warmth, but as a talisman, a reminder of the girl who had counted 500 baggage items and survived. Sarah Jenkins, the forensic accountant I had called in, was relentless. "Samantha," she said, voice low, "look at 1995. There's something in Cook County archives you need to see." I leaned over her shoulder, scrolling through digitized court documents, each line a dagger. Kevin and Karen Hart hadn't just walked away from me. They had filed a lawsuit against American Continental Airlines claiming negligence. They had fabricated an entire narrative, stating that I had been an unaccompanied minor sent to visit a sick relative. Every detail in their complaint was a lie, and the settlement they received for $450,000 was their payday for selling me as deceased. I didn't flinch. My hands were steady as I turned each page. Their signatures, jagged and loopy, confirmed everything. They had declared me legally dead. That check had been the receipt for my life. And now, decades later, they were attempting to cash in again. I took a deep breath, steadying my heartbeat. This was no longer about emotion. It was a chess match, and every move I had made over 30 years led to this board. I called my attorney. "Do not settle," I said. "We're going to trial. Everything they thought they could steal, they're about to lose." Preparation began immediately. Witnesses were lined up, forensic evidence cataloged. Every ledger, every casino receipt, every photograph was a weapon. The trial was a theater, and I intended to direct every act. The plaintiffs arrived first, Kevin and Karen, smug and confident, wearing muted suits that did nothing to hide the thin veneer of their composure. Their lawyer was rehearsed, ready to charm the jury with tales of parental agony. Karen's eyes were wet, lips quivering as she recited fabricated suffering. Kevin's jaw was tight, teeth clenched, but his confidence was still palpable. They had performed this grief for decades. They were seasoned actors. I remained in chambers mode, observing every twitch, every micro-expression. Their performance was impressive. Too bad the foundation of their lies was rotten. I had Megan Hart ready, a witness they would never anticipate. Megan, their other daughter, the one who had grown up in the shadow of their staged tragedy, was my ace. When she stepped into the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. Her posture, composed yet wary, betrayed none of the fear they had instilled in her. The resemblance to me was uncanny, though where I had grown sharp, she had grown cautious. Megan took the stand, swearing the oath. Her voice was quiet but steady, and what she revealed cracked the Hart facade completely. "Growing up in this household," she began, "was like living inside a mausoleum. Samantha was not just absent, she was an idea, a tool. We were raised to believe the tragedy of her disappearance defined our family. Every gift, every donation, every word of comfort from neighbors, it all came at the expense of the truth. Her eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Kevin and Karen. While the world thought they were grieving, they were calculating. The courtroom was silent. Kevin's smirk faltered. Karen's practiced tears threatened to give way to genuine panic. Megan reached into a tote and pulled out a shoe box, aged and musty with attic dust. She opened it, revealing faded casino receipts from the Empress riverboat in Joliet, dated precisely the week Samantha had been abandoned at the airport. The silence that fell was heavier than any I had ever known. This was not the suffocating, isolating silence of Terminal 3. It was the collapse of an empire of lies, a silence that pressed down on those who had spent decades thinking they could cheat the world and their own child. I stood slowly, walking down the aisle toward the defense table. My voice, when I finally spoke, was cold and measured. For 30 years, you believed Samantha Hart was a ghost. You sold her life for $450,000. Now you step back into her courtroom, hoping to profit from the same life again. You have miscalculated. You do not face a victim. You face the law. Their lawyer shifted uncomfortably, realizing for the first time the trap they had walked into. I let the silence linger, letting the truth sink like a stone. Every word Megan had spoken, every receipt, every affidavit, they had signed their own undoing. When the defense called me to testify, the air practically crackled. I stepped up calm, eyes locked on Kevin and Karen. In 1995, you declared me deceased, I said, voice precise, cutting through the courtroom. You accepted a settlement. You signed affidavits confirming my death. Now, in 2026, you attempt to sue me for my inheritance. You either committed fraud 30 years ago or you are committing perjury today. Either way, you are in violation of the law. Gasps echoed around the room. Kevin's face turned ashen. Karen clutched at his arm, nails biting into fabric. They understood, finally, that the game was over. The child they discarded had returned as the judge of their fate. I sat back, letting the courtroom tension build, knowing the final blow was coming. Evidence had been laid, testimony given, and now the silent calculation of 30 years of abandonment would be realized. This was only the beginning. The collapse of the Hart Empire, legal and personal, would be absolute, and the full force of justice would land with precision. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the storm in the courthouse. Inside, I was poised, every detail of my revenge meticulously orchestrated. The child who had counted 500 bags and cried in silence had become a woman who would wield the law like a weapon. And now, the first signs of their downfall were visible. I allowed myself a brief exhale. 30 years of preparation had led to this courtroom, and the Harts were about to learn that ghosts can haunt and the law can destroy. The courtroom was electric with tension. Every eye was fixed on Kevin and Karen Hart, and every whisper carried the weight of decades-long deceit. I sat behind the defense table, my red wool scarf draped over my shoulder like armor. The weight of 30 years of preparation pressed on me, not heavy, but precise, like the pressure of a scalpel waiting for the final incision. Megan had done the impossible. She had dismantled their public performance of grief and devotion, revealing the receipts, the lies, the casino trips, the falsified searches. But the final checkmate was still in my hands. I leaned forward, motioning for the bailiff to bring the documents I had prepared for weeks. Every page, every affidavit, every financial ledger was weaponized evidence. The plaintiff's lawyer rose, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, may I remind the court?" I cut him off with a glance so cold that he froze mid-sentence. "You may not," I said, voice even and deliberate. "This court is not a theater for theatrics. It is a place for evidence, and the plaintiffs have already committed fraud before this court. Every attempt to manipulate sympathy has been met with truth." I motioned to the clerk to enter a certified copy of the 1995 settlement agreement. The document slid across the table with a soft thud. The judge read it carefully, eyes narrowing as she glanced up at Kevin and Karen. The courtroom seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," the judge said, voice low and measured, "you accepted $450,000 from American Continental Airlines, declaring your daughter, Samantha Hart, legally deceased." The court recognizes that your current claims against your daughter's inheritance contradict a sworn affidavit you submitted in 1995. How do you explain this contradiction? Kevin's lips parted, no words coming. Corinne's mascara-streaked face twisted in panic. They understood immediately. This was not a question. They had walked into a trap. I stood, walking slowly toward the center of the courtroom, my gaze locked on them. You thought ghosts cannot fight back. You were wrong. You thought that decades of deceit would shield you. You were wrong. You thought the law could be bent with charm, tears, and performance. You were wrong. The gallery was silent, hanging on every word. I continued. You sold me for money. You treated my childhood as an investment ledger. And now you have attempted to turn the same ledger into a weapon against me. Today, that weapon is yours, and it will destroy you. I signaled to my attorney. He handed me a stack of additional evidence. Bank records tracing every dollar of the settlement, casino slips matching the receipts Megan had found, property acquisitions made possible with the funds intended for my supposed wrongful death. These, I said, lifting the papers for everyone to see, are not just receipts. They are proof of perjury, fraud, and exploitation. Every transaction, every document is your confession. Megan stepped forward, standing beside me for support. They used me too, she said, voice steady. I was the replacement. I was the one they raised while selling my sister. But the truth is finally here. Samantha survived. They cannot erase that. Kevin sputtered, trying to speak, but words failed him. Corinne clutched his arm, her tears now hollow, useless against the evidence arrayed before them. The judge slammed her gavel lightly, commanding order. This court finds the plaintiffs have engaged in fraudulent claims and perjury. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiffs are to be referred to the district attorney's office for investigation into criminal conduct, including insurance fraud and perjury. The officers moved in to escort Kevin and Corinne. Their screams echoed, but I didn't flinch. I didn't watch. My victory was not in their suffering. It was in the justice executed with precision, cold and absolute. 30 years of pain had led to this courtroom moment, and it was not personal. It was legal, undeniable, and final. Outside, cameras flashed as news crews captured the fallout. The headline read, "Parents who sold daughter face indictment." The church they had fooled for decades withdrew all support. Neighbors demanded restitution for years of deception. Their house, bought with the fruits of perjury, was now under legal scrutiny. Their empire, built on lies, collapsed. I returned to my office after the trial, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling. The red wool scarf rested over my chair, not a shield anymore, but a symbol. The child abandoned at baggage claim was gone. The woman who had reclaimed her life and her justice remained. Megan joined me, handing over a folder of documents for the new foundation we were building. "Baggage Claim Foundation," I whispered. "For every child left behind, every voice silenced, there will now be someone to stand in their place." She smiled, lighter than I had ever seen her, the weight of parental deception lifting slowly. I stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, letting the wind carry away the last remnants of fear. 30 years of waiting, planning, and surviving had led to this absolute, legal, and undeniable triumph. The child who had been left behind had returned as a judge, a survivor, and an executor of justice. The courtroom was silent, every ear straining to catch the final words. Kevin and Corinne Hart sat frozen, their faces pale and defeated. The red wool scarf rested over my shoulder, a symbol of survival, strategy, and unyielding resolve. I stood, letting my presence dominate the space. 30 years of betrayal had culminated here, and I would finish this with precision. "Your actions," I began, voice cutting through the hushed room, "were not mistakes. They were deliberate, calculated, and malicious. You declared me dead. You sold my life for $450,000, and now you attempted to claim what was never yours to begin with. Today, the law will ensure you face the full consequences of your choices." I motioned to my attorney, who presented a detailed forensic report tracing every financial transaction stemming from the 1995 settlement. Every property purchased, every luxury acquired, they had used the funds from my supposed wrongful death to enrich themselves. The judge's eyes narrowed as the evidence was laid bare. Megan Hart stepped forward again, her voice steady and unwavering. I lived under their control, believing my sister was lost forever, but Samantha survived. And today, justice is not just about truth, it's about accountability. The judge slammed her gavel. Kevin and Karen Hart, based on the evidence presented, this court finds you guilty of perjury, insurance fraud, and fraudulent claims. You are hereby referred to the district attorney for immediate criminal investigation. Any attempt to circumvent justice or claim assets derived from fraudulent activity will result in full prosecution. Your previous settlement with American Continental Airlines is declared null and void in light of these revelations. The officers stepped forward. Kevin tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Karen grabbed his arm, trembling. Their empire of lies collapsed around them. Headlines outside would later read, "Parents who sold daughter indicted. Chicago couple faces criminal charges for fraud. Decades of deception ends in court." I didn't watch them leave. I turned back to my desk, where the documents for the Baggage Claim Foundation awaited my signature. This wasn't about revenge, it was about building something enduring. Every child abandoned, every voice silenced would now have protection. Legal aid, foster support, advocacy, all under one roof. Megan joined me, her expression lighter than I had ever seen. "It's finally over," she said. I smiled, the tension of decades dissolving into something calm, solid, and purposeful. "It is," I replied. "But over isn't just about the past, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again." 6 months later, the foundation was fully operational. Court filings, legal defenses, and advocacy programs ran seamlessly. Foster children aged out of the system with confidence, knowing someone had their back. We named the foundation after the baggage claim where my life almost ended, not as a symbol of despair, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. I sat in a coffee shop downtown, the red wool scarf draped loosely around my neck. Megan laughed at a joke I told, the sound filling the space between us like sunlight after years of darkness. The silence underneath the chatter was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful, complete, and earned. I looked at the city beyond the window and realized the truth William had shown me decades ago. I wasn't the child left behind. I was the woman who had been caught, who had reclaimed her life, who had wielded the law like a weapon. And the Harts, the people who had treated their own child as currency, were left with nothing but the ruin of their choices. The red wool scarf, once a shield against abandonment, now hung lightly on my shoulders. It was not a barrier. It was a testament, a witness to survival, strategy, and ultimate justice. And in that silence, I allowed myself a full exhale. 30 years of preparation, pain, and planning had reached their conclusion. Samantha Hart had returned, triumphant, and the law had delivered its final, brutal verdict. No revenge, only justice, and for the first time I was free.